I hope there are a lot of questions or not, but there we go. So you can type your questions into the Q&A or chat function rather as we're going, but also feel free to hold them until the end. We will open up the line so that you can ask your questions in person if you prefer. Just we'll ask that you use the raise your hand function so that we can do our best to get to everybody and make sure we see that your hand is actually raised. As with all CHF member-only events, this briefing is not open to members of the press, so any of the comments made by our speakers today are off the record. However, we are trying to record the event so that if CHF members weren't able to join us, they can hopefully see it after the fact. And with that, I'm excited to introduce Dom and Matt. So for those of you who don't know them, Dom Ruscio is one of the founding partners at CRD Associates. He has more than 45 years of public policy experience, has held top posts in both Congress and the executive branch, serving on the staff of the Senate Appropriations Committee at the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare and the Department of Education. Matt Dennis is a senior vice president at CRD Associates, and he has 15 years of communications experience on Capitol Hill and for political campaigns. And prior to joining CRD, Matt was the communications director for the House Appropriations Committee Democrats, where he served as public spokesperson and managed media relations for the ranking member. So thank you both so much for taking time to talk to us today about earmarks. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say and asking you lots of questions at the end. So I will turn it over to the two of you and let you take it from here, Dom and Matt.
All right. Well, thanks, Erin. And thanks, Erica and Lindsay, for organizing this too. Now that Congress is turning its attention to the FY22 appropriations process, the whole subject of earmarks, as we've seen over the past couple of months, is really getting a lot of attention. So it's not entirely clear at this point how big a role earmarks are going to play in appropriations bills this year, but since it's been a while since earmarks were included in appropriations bills, we thought it would be helpful to CHF members to kind of get up to speed on the issue. Next slide, Lindsay. We're going to start out defining earmarks. And given how controversial the subject is, I think you'll see where you stand on earmarks depends on where you sit. And although we've seen earmarks, haven't seen earmarks in appropriations bills for about a decade, they're by no means new to the process. We're going to take a look at the role that earmarks have played in getting appropriations bills passed, how they helped advance public health, and why we haven't seen them for a while. And we'll go over some of the pros and cons of earmarks, at least in the context of public health funding. And then I'll hand it over to Matt to talk about the process, today's process, and look at how earmark requests are going to be evaluated and what impact we think they'll have. Next slide. I mentioned that where you stand on earmarks often depends on where you sit. The Congressional Research Service frames earmarks as a way for Congress to set some spending priorities. At its most basic level, an earmark enables a member of Congress to fulfill a need back in their state or congressional districts. In other words, truly represent their constituents. On the other hand, the executive branch describes earmarks as a way to get around merit-based criteria for awarding money. So the implication here is that any earmark is probably not the best use of taxpayer monies. But whatever your opinion of earmarks, I think the overriding fact is that the Constitution vests the power to decide how money is spent with Congress. So I think as a sort of traditionalist, if you will, the return of earmarks, I think, boils down to Congress kind of reasserting its own power. Next slide. And just to be clear, earmarks are not a new phenomenon. In fact, I went through some old files, pretty dusty files, and found that in the very first session of Congress, the 9th bill that Congress passed was to build a system of lighthouses on the East Coast. In order to get the votes to pass the bill, though, the Philadelphia delegation said they wouldn't vote for the bill unless it included a pier for Philadelphia. And so that actually was the first earmark, but they don't always succeed. About 30 years later, President Madison vetoed a tax bill because somebody tried to add an earmark in there to build a road through their state. Madison at the time said that Congress was overstepping its powers. So there's been this sort of give and take between the administration and Congress for a long time. Earmarks appeared very sparingly for the next 200 years, actually. It wasn't until the late 1990s and early 2000s that earmarks really began to take over the appropriations process, quite frankly. In fact, I looked at the last couple of bills before earmarks were banned. And in one bill, or I'm sorry, 1 year, there were 14,000 discrete earmarks in the appropriations bills, in all the appropriations bills. They totaled about $29 billion. So this wasn't chump change. But by that time, things had gotten so out of hand that Speaker Pelosi reformed the process, imposed some new restrictions on it. She tightened the rules, including one of the rules was requiring that members of Congress who were asking for earmarks verify that neither they nor their families had any financial interest in them. The following year, so that would be 2011, Republicans won control of the House of Representatives. They declared a moratorium on earmarks, and at about the same time, President Obama came out and said that he would veto any appropriations bill that included earmarks. So kind of a bipartisan effort there. And that moratorium that was put in place in 2011 was stayed there for another 10 years. Next slide. So while the vast majority of earmarks are fine, there were some abuses along the way that really made it easier to ban them. For example, and I just list a couple here, there was a $500,000 earmark for a teapot museum in Sparta, North Carolina. Senator Burr was a big proponent of that. There was another earmark, $3.5 million in Florida for a tunnel under one of the major highways there so the turtles could cross under the highway and not get squished. There was another earmark to study how alcohol affects mice. Then, of course, the Bridge to Nowhere, which you probably all know about, which actually caused so much controversy that it was withdrawn. But really, I think the biggest scandals, the ones that really led to earmarks being banned, involved illegal actions or unethical actions by just a handful of individuals. We had Congressman Randy Cunningham from California come to find out that he had accepted $2.5 million in kickbacks from defense contractors for steering earmarks their way. And we had a lobbyist named Jack Abramhoff who defrauded his tribal organization clients, among other things, and he was sentenced to 5 years in jail and fined $25 million. Next slide. So taken together, I think all of those scandals, the controversies and abuses, I think turned earmarks into a kind of a symbol of a corrupt and ugly process. And that's what led to to them being banned. It made a lot of good government advocates happy, and it took some pressure off of members of Congress. But I think rather than fix the problem, it created two others. First, it sent earmarks underground, where there was no public scrutiny, no accountability. People found workarounds. We had members of Congress quietly either calling or writing to a department head or an agency person to fund a particular project outside of the public view. Or members of Congress might withhold their votes on some important legislation unless they got their pet project funded. The second, and I think bigger problem, was that banning earmarks shifted the power of the purse from Congress to the bureaucracy. Next slide. Which brings us to today, when Congress seems to be embracing so-called pork barrel spending. I took some time to look at about a half dozen appropriations bills, labor age appropriations bills, when earmarks were still allowed. And I frankly, I found a lot of good examples of public health funding. Next slide, please. Maybe a little hard to read. There's a lot of things on here, but as you'd expect, most of these kinds of public health related projects were targeted to specific communities. But if you look a little deeper, you find that quite a few were written very creatively. They were written oftentimes as a demonstration project that would identify best practices and then were capable of being replicated in other communities. I think if your organization is considering going after an earmark, I'd encourage you to look at some of those older appropriations bills. I think you'll find some pretty creative approaches there to earmarking. Next slide. And I just want to finish up with just a few cautions here. First, keep in mind that earmarks are a one-shot deal. You're not setting up a program in perpetuity. So be prepared to have funding in subsequent years to continue those projects if they are meritorious. Second, I think generally earmarks are not going to be funded in large dollar amounts. I think you'll hear from Matt later on. There is an overall limit on earmark funds. So we're not talking about, several $million for each earmark. And lastly, I think you'll increase your chances of exponentially, I think, if you can point to some matching funds, something from public or private sources or from your organization itself. I think it's a good way to demonstrate that you have faith in the project itself. So I think if the new system works anything like the previous iteration, earmarking can be used to advance, I think, a pretty wide variety of public health initiatives. There are going to be some limitations, as I said, and Matt's going to get into those. I guess, why don't I just stop there and turn it over to Matt, who's going to talk about what this return to earmarks is going to look like.
Thanks, Dom. And thanks to Lindsay and Aaron and Erica for organizing this. So just looking at the kind of the logistics of how this is going to work. I mean, from a timeline basis, as most of you might know right now, if you were planning on submitting programmatic requests anyway, some of the member offices deadlines are occurring right now concurrently this week or previously. Most have extended their deadlines because the subcommittee deadlines are not until mid-April. The April 14th through 16th is the time where each of the 12 appropriations subcommittees have set their deadlines to receive requests from individual members. And that's for both programmatic requests, like increasing requesting a specific dollar amount for a particular account in an appropriations bill, or for these, as they're calling them now, community project funds. We don't know at this point when the markups will be, the subcommittee or full committee markups. One thing that I thought was interesting in the guidelines that the committee put out is that the earmark, the projects that the committees decide to fund with earmarks will be announced at subcommittee markup. These are all going to be in the report, not in the text of the bill itself. And usually that report doesn't come out until full committee markup. So it seems as though they're going to, at least that component of the report, they're going to release earlier than they ordinarily do. Can you go to the next slide, Lindsay? So a key question is how to get a individual member to request the project that you are asking for. I just put a couple images up here of the types of things, the types of photo ops that members of Congress really like, whether if they can break ground on for construction of a new, some new facility, if they can attend a ribbon cutting at a new, eventually. I mean, it's not gonna be immediate, but if they can attend a ribbon cutting, if they can give equipment to first responders, these are all things that make a very nice local splash that that they can point to as delivering direct, tangible results for their district, and that they can, frankly, here in many other contexts and political contexts as well. Next slide, Lindsay. Here are some of those limitations that that Dom was mentioning, and this first point I think is really important. Only certain accounts are going to be eligible for earmarking in each bill. So each of the subcommittees that is earmarking has put out guidance on what specific accounts are eligible and what types of projects might fit in those categories. I know all of us are very interested in all of those public health related items that Dom was mentioning, but it's important to kind of take a holistic view of all of the different types of projects that a member could request. A really big one is water infrastructure. If there are dams that need to be built or repaired, or dredging that needs to be done, engineering or ecosystem restoration, that can be requested through the energy and water bill. Law enforcement is a really big area for earmarking. Grants through the Burn JAG program at the Department of Justice, or the COPS program, community-oriented policing services, things that can improve community police relations, or deliver bulletproof vests or interoperable radio systems. Those are really good for members to request. Within the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA has a pre-disaster mitigation grant. If there's an area that tends to flood, that you can take some mitigation construction or measures to create marshland to prevent flooding of neighborhoods. There's nonprofit security grants. So if particularly nonprofits that have received threats based on their mission or the makeup of their organization, they can receive security grants. Emergency operations centers through the Department of the Interior, land acquisition, state and tribal assistance grants for clean water or for drinking water or wastewater infrastructure or sewers. Stormwater is, those are other items. Roads and bridges, obviously, that's, the kind of what most people think of most quickly, but transit systems as well. Military construction projects, I just bring up all of these different universes of items that are eligible for earmarking to make the point, because members are only permitted to request 10 total. So in order to get an individual member to request your particular item, it's really going to have to be bulletproof and well justified. And the case can be made that it's more beneficial to a community than something that might fall under any of those categories that I mentioned. This bullet, community support, this is a new requirement. A lot of the disclosure requirements that I talk about below, so certifying that you don't have a financial interest and that your family member doesn't have an interest, posting your requests online, a lot of that stuff were requirements under the previous Democratic majority from '06 to 2010 for earmarking. But this community support one is new, and what it requires is for members to submit evidence that the project they're requesting has, like it says, support in the community, whether that's through newspaper editorial boards or letters from mayors or county executives or the state government. Whatever that mechanism is, the members are supposed to demonstrate that this isn't just in the judgment of an individual member of Congress that this project is needed, but it's in the judgment of the local community as well. There's a ban on for-profit recipients. That's also a new requirement. So no corporations are permitted to receive earmarks. There are, and Dom mentioned, matching requirements are helpful as well, and the fact that this is one-year funding. You can't expect that the fact that if an earmark is funded 1 year, that it will be funded the following year. In fact, it's probably less likely to be, since members will probably want to spread around where they're, what they're doing and what communities they're helping. Here's the next slide, Lindsay. So how will the projects be announced and displayed? I mentioned that when they'll be announced is somewhat new, that we expect them to be released at subcommittee markup whenever that occurs. The image that you see on the bottom of the slide there is, it's obviously tough to read, but this is kind of how it looks in the report, a chart that displays the project, where it is, the member that requested it, and how much money. This particular one is from, I think, the FY10. This particular page is from, I believe, the FY10 Labor H bill. There are also, in previous versions, in the previous iteration of earmarking, there were also accounts throughout the bill that were earmarked, but most of them are displayed in the back of the report. Next slide, Lindsay. And the big question too is, will this change anything? As Dom mentioned, there's a constitutional argument for this of reclaiming the Article 1 power for Congress, because, even without congressional earmarking, there is administration earmarking. The administration, Congress really gives the administration the ability to decide where money goes. And the argument for members of Congress is that they know their districts best. Additionally, the people who really know what they're doing and who are in power, we're still really able to earmark even without earmarking. For example, I won't name names, but at a certain point, the members of Congress could tell how far down the list of priorities at an agency a project in their district was, and then give enough money to that agency such that the last project funded was in their district. So that's kind of a way that they would get around that ban. There is the theory that with more skin in the game, members will be more likely to vote for appropriations bills. If somebody who would be predisposed to vote against an appropriations bill, if they've got four or five projects in there worth, $400,000 to $600,000 each, where they can do ribbon cuttings about a new pedestrian walkway, construction on a new dam, giving bulletproof vests to law enforcement, all those types of things that I mentioned, they might be more likely to vote for that appropriations bill. Just yesterday, we saw the House Republican Conference voted narrowly to get rid of their conference rule prohibiting earmark requests. They're very split on it, though. It was a narrow vote, but Republicans will be able to request earmarks, but I don't expect that will change this from being used as a political weapon. Some members have put out reports of earmarks that, in their judgment, sound silly or sound like a waste of money. and use it to tar the opposition or tar an appropriations bill or the entire appropriations process as corrupt. I think it would be kind of naive to think that that's all going to go away now that everybody is permitted to request earmarks. So, I don't think we really know yet. This is the first, the first year of earmarking under this new system. So we're just really going to have to kind of see how it goes and whether it does change anything. So I will stop there. I don't think I have any more slides, and Dom and I can see if there's any questions.
Thanks so much, Matt and Dom. That was great. Nice overview. We'll give folks a minute to get their cameras back on and get your hands up if you have questions for our speakers. Mark with the first question.
Hi guys, and sorry I joined late. You may have already said this, but I haven't seen this in writing, Matt and Dom, but have you guys seen a $1 million limit on the earmarks? Have you seen any kind of limit on the size of an individual earmark cap?
I have not seen that. I think that is kind of, if not by policy, by effect. That was kind of the way that most of these were done previously. In that, that chart, that really small chart that I had on one of those slides, each of those was kind of between, $300,000 and $600,000. And each subcommittee does have different guidance. But Dom, did you see something at large for?
I have not seen anything specific, but I think the overall cap on earmarks, what is it, 1%? I think that's going to make it difficult for anybody except maybe the chairman or ranking member of the Appropriations Committee to go much beyond $1 million.
Okay, thanks.
I think the average, at least the last time around, the average was about $300,000.
Chris, I see your hand is up. Go ahead and ask your
Yes. Can you talk a little bit about that it's, at least within the HRSA projects, that they're community projects, but yet in some of the details that were circulated, you also need to justify why it's a good use of taxpayer dollars, which to me means more national. So how do you balance having something in a congressional district or a community project with, yes, this is a good use of taxpayer dollars?
I mean, ideally, the two wouldn't be mutually exclusive, or at least I think that's the case that you have to make in getting the request in. I think that really a lot of the rationale for why the subcommittees are requesting all of these different buckets of information is because honestly, some projects might end up as clunkers. There might be some that don't go well, and they don't have any interest in being held responsible for that. They want to have the the evidence at hand, say, hey, we were told by this member of Congress, we were given this letter of support from this mayor, from this county executive, this county legislature, that this is an important thing to do. It was requested by the member with all proper disclosures. They said it was a good use of taxpayer money, and we included it. I really think that that's a big part of it. So I think that you have to make the case both on a local level and on a macro level that would be a good use of money.
And Chris, that's why I brought up the idea of kind of characterizing it as a demonstration project, if that's appropriate. I mean, it's a good way to say, hey, look, yeah, this is for X community, but whatever we learn there, the lessons learned, we can be applied to just about any place.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Feel free to put your hands up if you have questions. I'll ask one in the meantime that I know has been kind of on the minds of some CHF members, but wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about the implications that earmarks might have on sort of other funding and the fact that this has to still come out of the same pot of money. So what implications for other public health programs that CHF members might be advocating for?
Well, the mechanics are pretty interesting. At least if they follow the same procedure as when earmarks were in effect 10 years ago, essentially each subcommittee at the beginning of the process kind of parks X amount of dollars someplace, puts that aside, and then goes ahead and makes its decisions program by program, you know, our regular HRSA programs, NIH, so on and so forth, and then goes back and takes that money that's been parked, and it could be $1 billion or whatever, and then begins to parse it out for specific earmarks. So that, I mean, on the one hand, and I remember back when earmarks were still in vogue, that you had organizations, bigger health organizations saying, geez, we could be using that money instead of putting it aside for earmarks. On the other hand, as Matt said, back in those days, it was used to help get appropriations bills passed. So it kind of offset that concern about money being drawn away from national programs.
Yeah, I think whether earmarks, whether they constitute enough money to subtract from overall programmatic levels is a concern, and I think a lot of that is going to depend on the allocations that the subcommittees get and the total amount of discretionary spending too. We're in an uncapped year without the Budget Control Act. However, the Budget Committee will still try to advance a FY22 budget resolution or else a deeming resolution to establish overall spending limit. So we'll be uncapped in a statutory sense, but there will still have to be some limit on overall spending, and whether or not that allows allocations to absorb earmarks without negative effects on other programs, I think we just have to wait and see.
And I don't know if others are hearing this too, but at least I've been hearing rumors that the budget is going to include a 10 to 15% increase for non-defense discretionary. So if that proves true, I think that eases the pressure on the allocations.
Good question just came in through the chat about the difference between the House and the Senate and which might be a better avenue for getting earmarks and how those two might play together.
Well, the kind of guidance that we've seen out of the House, we haven't seen out of the Senate yet. So I don't, it's kind of hard to answer that without seeing specifics out of the Senate. And my understanding is that the discussions are still going on between internally among Republicans and between Democrats and Republicans. So it's hard to know which is the better avenue and which is going to be the higher hurdle without having seen that yet. What do you think, Dom?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I don't know exactly how it's going to play out, but if history is any indication, the Senate, the last 3 years that the earmarks were in effect, the Senate would, let me back up. At the beginning of the process, they decide how much money they were going to put aside for earmarks. The House would get 50%, the Senate would get 50%. And then in those days, the Senate would then give 50% to Republicans, 50% to Democrats. I think there was only 1 year where that didn't happen. It was 60-40 or something. But the last few years, it's been 50-50, both House and Senate.
And Leahy has said that he would do that again if Republicans were to agree to bring them back.
Other questions from folks? before we wrap up? Lindsay, anything else in the chat? Okay, okay, thanks. Just give folks a minute. I don't see any other hands raised, so feel free to take yourself off mute if for some reason I've missed your hand and shout out now.
Hi, Erin, it's Eli with NACHO.
Hey,
I couldn't find my hand. So, but I had a question about the sort of interplay between earmarks and regular programmatic spending. You know, how do we, I mean, there's obviously a tension there. And I guess it sounds like earmarks will be somewhat limited, but how do we expect that to play out? You know, I know a lot of folks are asking for increases this year and in programmatic spending, and how do we expect earmarks to kind of play into that?
If you started to do any of the forms for individual member offices, you'll see that most of them will have a drop-down menu as to whether your request is programmatic language or a programmatic request, report language, or a request for community project funding. So those are kind of most member offices are giving you the option of choosing one of those three categories for what your request is. I'd also point out, you know, and you still have to prioritize what's your, you know, if you're submitting multiple requests, if you have 3 requests, for example, which of those is your top priority, which is number 2, which is number 3. And I guess the other thing that I would just point out too is that these community project requests from members of Congress to the Appropriations Committee, that limit of 10 requests is only focused on the community project funding. There's not, you know, your programmatic requests or your report language requests that are not for earmarks do not count against that limit of 10 requests. I don't know if that's helpful.
You know, if I could jump in on something, I don't know that it's been talked about. Just putting in a request, spreading them around to 5 or 10 members, I don't think that's going to work. I think you need to, if you have a champion, you're gonna need somebody that once you've left the office or virtually or otherwise, and they have a subcommittee markup and the doors are closed or the staff is putting together the markup notes, you're going to need to have somebody that's going to stand there and push for this issue. You know, I keep going back to, I think it was the first boot camp with Dana Acton, who said she was walking down the halls with other staff and talking about filling out these forms, and come to find out that other staff was saying, we never submit those things. We just take them, write them down, and, you know, send them a letter and thank them, and that's it. So, I mean, and maybe it goes without saying, but I just think you have to have a champion, somebody you know you can count on to do this. On that happy note.
While we all go find our champions. Any other questions? Feel free to shout out if you lost your hands like Eli. Great. Well, we will, if I don't see any other questions, wrap up here, and just a huge thank you, Dom and Matt, for taking the time to give this overview. It was really helpful, and especially for sort of digging back into where things were the last time we had earmarks in FY10. I think that was particularly helpful to look back historically. So we appreciate everyone joining us today. If you had a question that you didn't get to ask, feel free to share it with the CHF team, and we'll do our best to get it answered for you. But with that, we will end for today, and thanks everyone for the time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye now.